Very good. All right, so good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here for another session of the IMS Colloquium series, which really has been fascinating, I think, for the past 4 months already, or 3 months. Anyway, I think it's been, for me at least, a real pleasure to host such fantastic scholars. And right now we have another just fabulous scholar, Professor Jonathan Dunsby, who will in a moment start his lecture about the Scarlatti Sonata K87. I would just mention that the responders tonight would be Professor Barbara Berry and myself. Now, I must admit that I took the privilege to respond to Professor Dunsby just because of a last-minute cancellation, which I must say I'm delighted that happened, because it did give me the opportunity to engage with Jonathan's materials and share with you my thoughts later on. But then again, let's start with the main course for tonight. Let me just introduce our main speaker. Jonathan Dunsby is Professor of Music Theory at the Eastman School of Music, University of Rochester. He previously taught at King's College London, the University of Southern California, the University of Reading, and SUNY University at Buffalo. In early years, an international prize-winning piano student of Fanny Waterman, he graduated from New College, Oxford, and completed his doctorate under Alexander Gere. His books include Performing Music, Shared Concerns, and Making Words Sing, 19th and 20th Century Song. And he was the English translator for Oxford University Press of Nattier, Le Combat de Chrono et d'Orphée. More recently, he was co-translator and editor of Pierre Boulet's final volume of writings, Music Lessons, the Collège de France Lectures for Faber and Chicago University Press. His chapter for Geoffrey Swinkin's major publication, the Oxford Handbook of Musical Variation, is currently in press, and he is finalizing a book chapter for the University of Rochester Press on aspects of musical time, with analytical studies of music by Johannes Brahms and Unsuk Chin. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, can I just check that you can hear me? Yeah, right. Thank you, Barak, for such a generous introduction, and it's wonderful to see friends old in the sense of known for some time, and I hope new. And I'm grateful to you and all your colleagues for this invitation to speak about something important to me, at least. I want to mention that my work on this sonata of Scarlatti has been a long project. It first appeared in my CV about 15 years ago. Despite my endless fascination with this work, Scarlatti's Sonata in B minor K87, I never published anything on it, but just talked about it a lot, like I'm doing today. But in fact, my account of it will appear in print in a few weeks' time in a multi-authored book entitled Encountering Music Analysis, Structure, Performance, Text, and Beyond, a Festschrift for Lauri Sopa, published by the Sibelius Academy in Helsinki, edited by Marcus Mantera, Cecilia Oinas, and Inkari Jakula. Some of you will know that Lauri Sopa has been teaching a long time at the Sibelius Academy. In fact, this is his 25th anniversary, and that's where the idea of the book came from his colleagues and students. And my presentation today is a distillation of that research. I've kind of written it out. I know you can all read, and so I do sometimes have second thoughts about that mode of presentation, but my dear colleague and friend Arnold Whittle always says you'd probably rather hear what I've thought carefully about. So that's the way I'm going to do it. By way of orientation, I want to mention that my title, which is To Be a Saint, Domenico Scarlatti's K87, refers to Scarlatti's memorable appearances in Jose Saramago's 1987 novel Balthazar and Blimunda, supposedly in Lisbon in about 1716. Scarlatti's final exchange with the heroine, who is a peasant witch, as some of you may know, called Blimunda, is recorded in Saramago's signature minimalist punctuation. What is it to be a saint, Signor Scarlett? You tell me, Blimunda. Pure fiction, of course, that exchange. But then so are the majority of supposed facts about Scarlatti and his more than 500 keyboard sonatas, some of them almost certainly for piano, that have become part of a 3-century mythology built up about this mysterious life and its mysterious works. In his authoritative 2003 book about Scarlatti's sonatas, Dean Sutcliffe posed a number of palate-cleansing questions for the reasonably informed reader, such as the following. Did Scarlatti play his own works as a young virtuoso? We don't know. Under what circumstances were the sonatas written? We don't know. Why were so relatively few of the sonatas published in the composer's lifetime? Were the Scarlatti sonatas performed at all at the Spanish court, as the history books will tell you? If so, where, when, and by whom? Those are Dean Sutcliffe's words, not mine. And finally, rather impishly, did Domenico Scarlatti become Fatty Scarlatti? Dean is referring there to the fact that Scarlatti was supposed to have been observed in older age, having failed to remain as thin as he was when he was young, and therefore there's question about the cross-hand techniques in the virtuoso sonatas. Sutcliffe would not be asking such questions if we have even moderately well-informed answers to them, and this tells us the extent to which studying a work such as the K87 Sonata is studied in pretty much of a vacuum. My understanding of Scarlatti's sonata will be in dialogue with a number of challenging historical issues, and it's to some extent a critique of Carl Schachter's intriguing claim that music analysts are not looking for underlying mental structures or, say, patterns of repression in imagery, because a work of music in a perhaps strange formulation by Schachter is, quote, incomparably more important than its structure. I'll come back to that quotation later. My own feeling is that structure and pattern are essential components of our understanding of this music, but I'll be discussing it in continual dialogue with issues of historical interpretation. The idea that Scarlatti sonata can be understood in a chronological corpus in what Sutcliffe calls the panorama tradition has been as endemic as it is entirely speculative. This is a fictive tradition in which each sonata has become a kind of miniature, and then again, to quote Sutcliffe, a miniature contributing to the complete canvas, end quote. As successive generations of Scarlatti experts have tried to write a conspectus of his creative career, on keyboard at least, especially to establish a sense of chronology. Thus, K87 has often been referred to as an early work of Scarlatti, though its existence before 1749 is not demonstrable. The reason I say 1749 will be obvious to all of you. Not only do we not know whether K87 is relatively juvenile or mature Scarlatti, and whether that would make any difference to how we understand it, even if we did know, but we do not even know such a simple contextually independent factor as whether it was thought by its composer to be a slow piece, or moderately slow, or moderately fast, or fast. We do know, however, contextually, that he must have intended something by composing mostly, if probably ironically, in a contrapuntal improvised style. By the way, we'll be hearing the work in a few minutes' time. Works of this kind are uncommon in his supposedly 555 sonatas. By the way, there probably aren't 555 literally, but Kirkpatrick kind of manipulated the corpus to come out at a nice round number like that. Shevelov believes that K87 is so unusual that it could even be arranged from an ensemble work, as is the case with 5 other sonatas. That is, in this significant respect, it would represent at most about 1% of Scarlatti's known sonatas. I'm going to take a moment out here to let you hear the work Tech Willing, and Barak and I did test it about 10 minutes ago. It's been recorded many dozens of times. There's a long history here going back to the fact that Horowitz recorded it at least 3 times, and it probably gained its initial popularity in the 20th century, thanks to Horowitz, who, as you may know, was an absolute connoisseur of Scarlatti's keyboard output. I've chosen a fairly recent recording by the great Federico Colli, who was the 2012 winner of the Leeds International Piano Competition. It's among the slowest of the many recordings I've studied, and while it may not be to everyone's taste, I would guess that no lover of Western art music could fail to appreciate the subtlety of Colli's rubato and the integrity of the real-time musical narrative that he creates here. And just as a footnote, let me mention that this is an edited version of Colli's recording because I've had to delete both repeats in the interest of time. And of course, that naturally destroys an important part of his interpretation. But I hope it doesn't destroy his basic understanding of the music. I am now going to attempt to share my screen. Barak, can you see that? And hopefully we can now hear the music. So now let's begin to explore this music from various perspectives, starting with the perhaps naive assertion that it's very melodic. And I hope you can now see examples 1A and 1B. Regarding only the opening, which you can see in 1A, it's not difficult to hear an exquisite melody, which not only offers some semblance to the classical phrase structure, representing what Schoenberg called the aesthetic of the 8-bar phrase, but also a nice symmetry closes off the opening melody. You can see the brackets are now drawn, marked with an X in example 1A. At the beginning of the last large phrase of the first half, if you look at 1B, there's some element of thematic repetition and phrase extension, as it would come to be called in respect of later Viennese classical composition. However that may be, this piece does not do what later melodious compositions might lead us to expect retrospectively. For a start, at the very point of phrase extension, the voice leading is irregular, as Scarlatti must intend it to be. The motive from the opening in bar 2 seems to be constructed out of 2 parts or voices in bar 24, which you can see on the lower system of the example there. Compare X and Y in example 1B. Yet in bar 25, the music seems to fragment for a moment, as indicated by the arrows that I've drawn in and the Arabic numbers, into possibly 5 parts or voices. And this has already happened for a brief moment in the second beat of bar 11. It'll be obvious from the score in general that there are many instances of loose part writing, which is clearly one of the signatures of this composition. I'm going to be discussing this aspect quite a lot. It's an important aspect of how we evaluate K87 if we are claiming that the piece is not merely highly contrapuntal, but in fact pseudo-contrapuntal. Shevelov went so far as to assert some 40 years ago that K87 must be an arrangement of an ensemble work, as I mentioned a bit earlier. While it's not difficult to empathize with the perceptions leading to that supposition, evidence-based analysis of this music must tell us that Scarlatti is making a keyboard piece simulate an ensemble piece. In many sonatas, Scarlatti enjoys creating an elusive boundary between the polyphonically strict and free, usually in compositions where elsewhere there's no question of them being arrangements of ensemble works. And in truth, there's no evidence of any single decisive case in all of Scarlatti's output. On the other hand, if and when Scarlatti does care to write impeccable counterpoint, that's exactly what he produces. Scarlatti is using polyphonic inconsistency in this music deliberately. It's what theorists reasonably call a compositional device, though it could have been something entirely intuitive in the act of creation. Certainly, K87 is contrapuntal in style, as Shevelov rightly says, and it's also highly imitative in ways that have not, I believe, been discussed by other commentators. It offers a persistent, invariant feature, the motive of a descending line from B down to F sharp, often in the tenor register, which, taken together with some transposed instances, covers pretty much every bar of the sonata. Example 2 here shows the first half of the sonata analyzed in this way, as indicated by my added slurs, solid slurs and broken lines. It indicates not only the invariant progression, but obvious occurrences of transpositions as well, strictly in the musical foreground and untransposed, so that inversions, for example, are not noted, though there are plenty of them, and with no middle ground invariant or transposed versions. So it's showing merely, as it were, the overt bits of melody that we could have pointed out conversationally to Scarlatti himself, just as he surely would have pointed them out to us. Admittedly, the whole procedure becomes theoretically self-evident towards the cadences, where Scarlatti is fusing his melodic materials into scalic passages. If you have a look at the bottom system of the first half, in that example that I hope you can see those longer scalic passages. Question is, can we now hear this music without noticing the descending tetrachord motive? More theoretically, we might ask what kind of analysis like this can mean. Did Scarlatti set out to compose a piece showing a high degree of metillic invariance? If so, he's not subscribing to any known compositional device. The invariance shown here in K87, if you can for the moment agree with that, is not an example of ground bass, of divisions, of some kind of instrumental cantus firmus. In short, it's not an example of any recognized form-building device in 18th century composers, whether they're being modernistic or writing in a traditional contrapuntal style. To the extent that there was specific intention or awareness when Scarlatti penned this score, and even if not, probably we are seeing here the effects of what Sutcliffe describes as a, quote, memorable contour and the color of particular notes. Yet we have to ask, a contour memorable only in itself or reminiscent of something else? An awareness of the stylistic context makes this question, what Scarlatti intended by the descending fourth motive in K87, all the more intriguing, since there is one obvious intertextual reference. Any Baroque piece in minor, beginning with a descending fourth in the bass, is going to be thought of as a lament. We may assume that comment holds good for the composers and listeners of the time. If we want to see a double iteration of the lament motive as the explicit compositional premise of K87, so for instance, compare bars 1 in the left hand and 5 to 6 in the left hand. There's no difficulty in hearing many subsequent strategic reflections of that. This kind of free treatment of a figure is hardly unfamiliar in early 18th century Italian keyboard music, but such a specific concentration on what is often called the Baroque lament topic is hardly common outside of vocal music. And what's striking in the Scarlatti is the delicate balance between overt and veiled references to the tetrachord. Observing it as an underlying feature can run counter to what Richard Cheruskin, for one, believed to be the essentially abstract nature of this repertoire. And this is a quote from Cheruskin, quote, "The most remarkable aspect of Scarlatti's sonatas may be the absence in them of anything symbolic at all." End quote. It may be then that Cheruskin would have characterized the lament motive in K87 as anything but melodic, anything but symbolic, I apologize. Rather, a specific intertextual reference to music of lament, not representative in some way, but the thing itself, the music of lament. I'm going to experiment with unsharing my screen and see what happens to give you a rest from the shared screen. All that might lead us to speculate that Federico Colli and his forebear adherents of the slow interpretation of K87 has adopted its symbolic meaning as a key to its interpretation. If you already know this sonata and you know it from any number of particularly mid to late 20th century piano recorded performances, you probably think it's a fast piece. Some of them are very fast. The difference in tempo between the slowest and the quickest versions is a factor of double. However, it may be in more concrete issues of interpretation that we can pursue a deeper aesthetic picture through analysis. Modern scholarship does offer some grist for that mill. Shevelov, in a more recent piece of writing in 2008, has provided a detailed history of the physical, written, and printed object in its various forms of K87, and some degree of analytical interrogation of this music. And he draws 4 conclusions that I'll mention here one by one, with some comments of my own. First, he notes that the music has what he calls a norm of 4 voices. which is a sustainable point, though he also recognizes that the voice leading is not consistent, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes the music is apparently in 5 parts. Very often it's in 3. Secondly, Sheloff confirms that the tempo of K87 is unknown, as you've heard me say repeatedly. There's no authentic tempo or genre indication, and no copyist or editor seems to have speculated that such ever existed. What's more, contrary perhaps to the popular belief that Scarlatti rarely gave tempo or generic information, this mysterious aspect of K87 is true of only a handful of his sonatas. There's a strong performance tradition at work based on the belief, recycled again by Shevelov, that Scarlatti, quote, just naturally gravitated away from writing truly slow movements, unquote. Actually, the great majority of Scarlatti's sonatas are indeed designated as allegro or even quicker. But that does not mean that his slower sonatas, which are usually referred to as his andantes, are somehow necessarily tainted with his supposed proclivity for speed. The problem is, however, that internal evidence can hardly argue for the differences between quite slow and very slow, which, by the way, Shevelov attempts to do, in my view, unsuccessfully, by suggesting that the hemiolas in the second part, to which I will come back later, are somehow more perceptible depending on the tempo. Shevelov's third observation is that performing the first bar of K87 presents an unusual task. And here I'm going into theory nerd mode, because this may seem relatively trivial, but it does set off a chain of significant perceptions about this music. And I'm going to hopefully share my screen again and move you forward. I hope you can now see example 3, the varied reprises. Forgive me if we spend a few minutes here going down what is popularly called a rabbit hole. That is, somewhere to get lost and lose a sense of relevance. But I'll argue that the little detail of the opening triggers resonances throughout the piece. It's true that the opening idea of this piece is difficult to understand, as Shevelov rightly says. The notation instructs us to make the 2 initial middle Bs sound like different voices. You can all see that in the top system, the first item in the left hand there. Using 2 harpsichord manuals offers no sensible way physiologically to make an oral distinction between the 2 middle Bs. I've tried it, it just doesn't work. The 2 Bs seem to indicate that 1 key under the finger is supposed to be used in different ways dynamically. This alone makes sense, for example, of Igor Kipnis's decision to perform a piece on the clavichord, where that's certainly possible. That's one of the most important historic recordings of this sonata. Yet an early piano would also accommodate the double B feature. It's now known that Scarlatti was familiar with many different pianos throughout his professional career. From a more theoretical point of view, on the other hand, we can see how this provocative initial performance conundrum opens up a contrapuntal agenda for the whole piece. And this is just like the kind of musical quiz that Scarlatti loved so much. Variations of the opening idea are going to recur, not surprisingly, and I've shown what I regard as the significant ones of these in example 3. The inherent challenge for clarification of the opening formula, which is going to be heard twice, remembering that the first half is going to be repeated, seems to be involved compositionally in various ways in what follows. Although it might be an overstatement to speak of progressive clarification of the initial idea, nevertheless, the simplicity of the 3-part version in bar 51 can be felt to be conclusive. I won't say more about that, but you only have to scan down those examples to see what it might mean to claim that there is a kind of clarification of the repeated B idea. The fourth and final point from Shevelov is that, and I quote here, super legato performances from harpsichordists, fortepianists, and modern pianists cause harm to the projection of the structure of the phrases, and most especially of the ever-shifting balance of voices. Specifically, Shevelov observes that there are important eighth note rests in the piece, and these are so intriguing that I'm going to show you them all. What could be intriguing about eighth note rests? Well, here we go. This is example 4, and I've indicated either by arrows where the rests come in what we could call a melody, or I've circled them when the rests come in a part. I hope that distinction helps to just, quickly scan through that visually. You can see where you see an arrow, it's in the melody, where you see a circle, it's in a part. And what it is always an eighth note rest. In what Shevelov calls super legato performances, he feels that all these rests will disappear into the mist of unending melody. He clearly disapproves of that. However, observe that all these rests introduce some kind of anacrusis. It means that conceptually there is nothing to fill the space they occupy in even the most finger-held or perhaps over-pedaled performance. If you look at bar 35, for example, at the top, the right-hand page here, no mode of interpretation can confuse our hearing of the lucid three-part writing. The lines in this bar are unambiguous, even if you play them on a modern piano with a sustaining pedal held right through it. Additionally, in some cases, the voice leading may be in flux in a way that precludes the perception of a rest by any means. If you look at bar 25, which is the second to the bottom system on the left-hand page, second bar of that system, the eighth note rest in the upper part in bar 25, you can see I've marked that with an arrow, is an example of one of the inaudible rests, in that the voice to which it belongs does not exist until the rest is replaced by a note. So B in the upper part, assuming that A falls to G in bar 25. And in the same way, if you look in the previous bar, you can see that E falls to D sharp, even though the notation, which we believe to be authentic, suggests that there are two different parts there. So you could imagine popping an eighth note rest in bar 24 over the second beat. Why not? It's just that nothing happens to look as if it's coming in over the top at that point. But the thing that comes over the top in bar 25, I don't think you hear anything until it begins with the B on the fourth eighth of that bar. Today's performers will endorse the ideal of as accurate a performance of the score as is feasible, yet it's hardly possible to ponder different ways of playing rests that are either hardwired and unavoidable or notational and not hearable anyway. And the analytical point is that in interpreting what Shevelov calls the structure of phrases, we absolutely should distinguish between actual and notational rests. If a moment of respectful accusatory tone may be excused, unlike Shevelov, we should surely be analysing the musical content of K87 rather than just its notated similarities. In view of the time, we might come back to that example, and I could play it again and see whether you can actually realistically hear any single eighth note rest anywhere in this piece. I would submit the answer is probably not, but I'll carry on. Where Shevelov's conclusions are interesting, if partly questionable, Sutcliffe's considerations are pivotal, at least in the puzzles they suggest, memorably evoking the interplay between Enlightenment sensibility and our modern hermeneutics. Sutcliffe, in his book, The Keyboard Sonatas from 2003, by the way, he sees K87 as in a state of balance. Quote, there is a fundamental decision to be made by the performer concerning its historical status, end quote. What's undoubtedly perceptible within the medium for him is what he calls the free polyphony. This is exactly what a keyboard can achieve. belying Shevelov's speculation that K87 may be the transcription of an ensemble piece. Sutcliffe wants us to reflect on how and why Scarlatti is composing retro music in K87. Quote, by definition, there will be a gap in the perception of the piece, since the style it embodies is not compatible with the modern musical dialects of Scarlatti's time, end quote. What is and was retro about K87 is its reference to the sacred. Again, I quote from Sutcliffe, quote, this gap was exploited as much by composers in the sacred genres, which were the usual home of the stile antico, so as to suggest the historical and moral authority of a past style, end quote. He maintains that we can repossess this reverse modernism. Quote, its very inaccessibility to the modern sensibility, both then and now, is what guarantees its effect, end quote. In other words, what was retro in the mid-18th century is something we can still perceive as retro. Sutcliffe suggests here a layer of fundamental ambivalence, for it's probably the genres of the sacred rather than secular that spiral around our feeling for what this music is partly about, much as they probably did for Scarlatti's contemporaneous audience, if there was any audience. Sutcliffe finds the balance between incompatible readings of K87 to be reflected in the two typical ways in which the, quote, voluminous reception of the piece tends to go. Those ways wanting us to understand the piece as, in my words, truly retro, and so not self-consciously so. And those ways privileging the nostalgia of the anachronistic, shaping K87 into what Sutcliffe diagnoses as the height of emotional poetry. And I'm sure Federico Colli would not object to me saying that his interpretation is an absolute classic of the latter approach. Partly this is the difference between the relatively strict lack of rubato, terrace dynamics rather than swells and lyings down, continuity of voice leading, so on, and the relatively free. Yet we also see this balance reflected in critical and perhaps even theoretical understanding. Shevelov guessing that K87 might be an arrangement of an ensemble work is surely thinking of the truly retro, since it's only by marginalizing the polyphonic inconsistency that he can shrug off its anachronistic modernist status. Whereas a Schenkerian approach to Scarlatti, to which I'm going to move here, whether you like it or not, may well be thought to represent the other side of the balance, valuing a work like K87 for what it turned out to hold in common with the future, rather necessarily than anything it was at the time. Sutcliffe probably provides the lead by interrogating the music rather than telling his reader how to hear it. And there may well be a further ambivalence in play with K87, beyond the old and the contemporaneous, beyond the secular and the sacred, and even beyond whatever is perceptible within the medium, that is, beyond polyphonic inconsistency, working against expectations of imitation and part-writing integrity. It may well be credible to claim, as Heinrich Schenker did in 1925, that Scarlatti was, in Schenker's crude chronological reckoning, quote, the first to bring true counterpoint into play, who set free a fundamental structure hitherto only half glimpsed and transformed its primal intervals into interval progressions, end quote. Not only did Schenker himself claim this, but his lead has been followed by modern theorists, for example, David Smith, who tells us that, quote, taking our cue from Schenker's analysis, it's a simple matter to locate further examples of octave lines. Domenico Scarlatti's keyboard sonatas with their rhyming cadence phrases include numerous examples. Can it really be true, as he implies in Pan-Schenkerian zeal, that it's no surprise at all to find a Schenkerian fundamental structure in a Scarlatti sonata? Well, whatever a full answer to that question may be, one partial response is that it must always be worth passing a sonata through the grid of Schenkerian thinking, hopefully sensitively applied and without prejudging the results. Here in my example 5, we can see a background analysis with a few middle ground features. And this is my own reading, as I've not found anything similar about K87 in the music theoretical literature. If there is anything similar, I hope you'll tell me in due course. Despite the fact that this sonata appears to have no normal or conventional overall syntax of thematic relationships, the prolongation of, in Schenker's jargon, an interrupted 5-line with standard bass arpeggi seems unmistakable in Scarlatti's composition. The thematicism in this piece may well reflect other layers of ambivalence. In his commentary, Sutcliffe refers to what he nicely calls the, quote, unprincipled variety of the surface, end quote. Yet it's equally plain, as shown earlier, that the musical foreground offers comprehensive motivic invariance, which, by the way, Dean Sutcliffe never mentions. And the Schenkerian analysis indicates how this is anchored in background voice leading. The resonant structural background also makes it difficult to accept Shevelov's interpretation of K87 as fundamentally incoherent, or at least multiform, concentrating, as he does, on the notable contrast between its halves. The second half introducing chromatic inflections, short phrasing, and multiple sequences in what he calls, and this is his title, Scarlatti's duck-billed platypus. These provoke Shevelov into considerable advocacy for his aesthetic perception of, one may guess, complexity. And this is a quote from Shevelov. Wherever one looks within the second half, Scarlatti constantly reworks everything and reorders the ideas from the way they appeared previously, in a manner halfway between a written-out improvisation and a classical development or free fantasy section, end quote. The chromaticism increases, he claims, to the point of being quite disconcerting, and he says that the phrases become almost breathless. Yet the point is, with such an apparently strong control of the underlying voice-leading structure in this composition, Scarlatti can afford any amount of foreground development or fantasy. It's hardly surprising that such an imaginative composer should want to intensify the interplay between background unity and foreground complexity, the unifying thread in K87, what the Romantics would have called in French its grande ligne, long before the age of Schenker, endows meaning to any amount of improvisation or development in such a carefully crafted composition. Carefully crafted, as it obviously must be when there is so much intricate contrapuntal interaction between the voices. What you see here in my annotations is a structural balance which complements the foreground stylistic balance described in Sutcliffe's connoisseur summary of K87 in its 18th century context. Anchoring that balance is a background structure typical of what would come to be called sonata form. Formally, the later sonata form model is not in evidence in K87. We don't find, for instance, the rotational logic that James Hepakoski's sonata theory would lead one to expect, nor James Webster's definitional idea of a simultaneous reprise, or as my American friends would say, simultaneous reprise. If there were a recapitulatory rotation or a sense of simultaneous return in K87, it would perhaps be at bar 51, which you can see at the end of the third system here, where on the right-hand page, where opening material and tonicized harmony recur, whereas the tonic harmony in bar 37 was passing. Still, the typical background structural mechanism of a tonal masterpiece in sonata form is played from our Schenkerian reading. The 5-line is interrupted at about the double bar, and in the second phase, the fundamental line descent is supported by a subdominant middle ground arpeggiation. That's in bar 48, which is, you can see, towards the beginning of the third system on the right-hand side. Probably the dividing dominant in the bass, the 5 of the 1-5-1 fundamental structure, is at the end of the first half, or that's where I've shown it anyway in example 5. One notable feature of the analysis in example 5 is how distinct the first half of the sonata appears to be from the second half. And here Shevalov's musical intuitions are supported, I'm glad to say. Any reader able to assimilate the graphics in example 5, perhaps on trust, can understand that these intend to show how Scarlatti's compositional muse is not interested in elaborating the musical space in the first half between F sharp and C sharp of the fundamental line. So if you look on the left-hand page, the caroted 5 and the caroted 2. This is so even though bars 26 to 27 are for sure a turning point in the music, Schenker or no Schenker, in that this is where Scarlatti dips into the short but sweet, guess what, flamenco passage. This succession is anything but unique in K87 among Scarlatti's sonatas. In fact, Sutcliffe nails this by commenting, and he's not talking about K87 here, that, and I quote, one common scenario in Scarlatti is to begin with a contrapuntal gambit and by degrees move towards the realm of a dance-like and popular, sometimes with suggestions of flamenco rhythm. The specific composing out in the second half of K87 of the structural model laid out in the first half may be said to settle the piece down. In bars 1 to 34, E and D in the curve of the melody have not been given the imaginative weight that the second half will reveal. So just to state the obvious, you can see how the fourth and third degrees on the second half in the fundamental line are much more prolonged than the rapid 4 to 3, almost passage work that we get in the first half. We also see in example 5 that Scarlatti is thinking, not in these terms at the time, but concretely, of, in Schenkerian jargon, an initial ascent or space-opening motion, arriving at F sharp in the octave above middle C in the upper line in bar 10, about a seventh of real time into the sonata. He does go above that register in the second half, and those moments carry intense expressive weight, almost at the top of what is thought to be the kind of keyboard Scarlatti had in mind. My favorite moment in this piece, by the way, is in bar 54. If you look at the fourth system on the right-hand page, that exquisite little movement through G to G sharp. Still, F sharp is the controlling peak of the melodic landscape of K87, and its regularly calibrated descent to B in the second half marks the musical logic of Scarlatti's musical imagination, in my opinion. Not everyone will necessarily agree, especially in light of the above comments on the pacing of the fundamental line descent in the second half, with the reading offered here of the first half. For the essential motion of the fundamental line between a primary melodic tone F sharp and the gold tone at the point of interruption, C sharp, for this to occur in the space of 3/8 notes, end of bar 26, beginning of bar 27, is bound to send experienced Schenkerians looking elsewhere between bars 10 and 27 for possibly deeper prolongations of the intervening tones E and D. There are alternatives, such as regarding the E in bar 13, that's the beginning of the third system on the left-hand page, connecting to D in bar 14, initially an inner part, but then emerging and conceivably explicitly prolonged until bar 27. There's probably little to choose between a potentially more evenly spaced descending fourth between bars 10 and 27 and my rapid last moment descent shown in example 5 that scampers on the surface to the background supertonic level from a long prolonged melodic background dominant. In either case, we have a correspondence between underlying vocal descent and the essential foreground motivic content of the music. And this may seem one of two things. On the one hand, you may expect spectacular if we ask what are the chances of a piece saturated with descending fourths in almost every bar also being controlled compositionally by a descending fourth fundamental in the first section. Or, admittedly, you could say that this is spectacularly inconsequential, in that the chances are pretty good. Think of the innumerable pieces that use motivic descending scale fragments in imitative styles while also revealing an interrupted 5-line background. Any piece of that kind is going to look like this piece. More than any other feature, though, it's the extreme use of scalic melody that would indicate the kind of thought processes I'm attributing to Scarlatti. He emphasizes this effect of the cadences. Look at example 6a that I've now projected, where in the first case, not only is the entire conceivable pseudo-vocal range covered, 2 octaves plus neighbor notes, but in a burst of self-revelation, Scarlatti continues to take the voice down to its extreme, covering 4 contravocal octaves in 3 bars. And at the end of the piece, spills down to literally unsingable depths. Note how the 2 octave song scale, and what could be more cadential, more falling, is already in our ears explicitly, if subliminally, derived from the bassline prototype in bars 15 to 19. That's showed in the 3rd system down there. The urge for scales to proliferate beyond straightforward running up and down is represented, for example, when they would otherwise exceed the registral limit of the voice. Hence the registral transfer shown in example 6b here. You can see where I've got a little arrow pointing up in the penultimate bar. Or when they would exceed the very range of the instrument, as shown in example 6c. I told you this was my favorite bar. At the point which seems climactic in at least 2 respects, the enforced Mozartian 7th as the scalic voice bumps against its physical limit, and the exquisite direct chromatic apposition of G and G sharp. Also, as we know from the Schenkerian reading I showed you, the fundamental line finally settles onto a prolonged melodic mediant over a long tonic harmony ahead of the closing background motions to the tonic of both melody and harmony. Whatever else Scarlatti's thinking may have been when writing this piece, thinking in the sense of musical invention, stepwise motion figured large. Those used to teaching Schenker will know that discriminating between a 3-line and a 5-line is often a matter of some subtlety. The most musical of minds can well fixate on the seeming establishment of a potential primary melodic tone, D, in bar 5. This is why I've sent us back to example 5 in the screen share. Losing oral awareness of the double chromatic tonicization of the low F sharp in bars 7 to 8 and the overall shape of the first half, which repeatedly peaks at F sharp. A further structural point in discriminating the potential 3 from the actual 5 is the obligatory register of the bass, which arrives only in bar 19, according to my red annotations here, well clear of the primary melodic tone having been established, but confirmatory during the phase of melodic reinforcement that the true bass supports. In the second half, any trace of melodic mediant control after the structural interruption is firmly led to its proper grounding under the controlling dominant melodic prolongation by a strong hypermetrically accented sequential ascent to E. So you compare bars 39 and 40 with bars 41 and 42. That initiates the second structural descent from F sharp. There must always be a case for considering different possible backgrounds in a Schenkerian reading of a tonal masterpiece. In the end, however, it's not a matter of superior argument, but of what is and what is not confirmed by the intense experience of the composition. I think this is probably what Carl Schachter meant with his rather opaque statement that, quote, the work is incomparably more important than its structure. The richness of Scarlatti's thinking is not exhausted merely by technical observation. In closing the technical parts of this discussion, let me also finally reconsider Sutcliffe's fertile idea of a gap of the challenges to our perception in a piece where the style it embodies is not compatible with modern musical dialects of Scarlatti's time. In his use of extravagant scalic materials, Scarlatti is interrogating his own polyphonic manner. Normally, real voices cover a range of a tenth and more, but not the multiple octave ranges found in K87, especially at the cadences, where the foreground line exceeds what any voice could sing or be imagined to sing. That scenario becomes subtly suspect in bars 5 to 8, the polyphonic scenario, where you can see that all the voices move down together towards the minor dominant. There is something anti-contrapuntal about this communal registral slide, indicating that not all is what it appears to be. The instrumentality that is to unfold becomes a certainty in the next large phrase, beginning with the 2-octave scalic trajectory of the bass from bar 15, confirming where it needed the authentic instrumental nature of this composition, which the flamenco passage then places beyond doubt in, as confirmed by Sutcliffe, a normative first half procedure for Scarlatti, but one that's susceptible to many different kinds of treatment in the second half of the sonata. In this complex invention, Scarlatti is not going to give up in the second half the rich resources that characterize the first. On the contrary, the beginning of the second half rekindles polyphony in a formally conspicuous passage following the first half repeat that not only could be sung nicely, but it even uses inversion explicitly. If you look at the lower and middle parts at the beginning of the second half, you can see how they're in its explicit inverted relationship. And this explicit inversion is surely a signal of polyphonic vocality. Yet, only some 12 bars later, from about bar 48, polyphony will give way to hemiolas with thirds and sixths against pianistic octaves in the left hand. That, did Scarlatti but know it, with 3 centuries of hindsight, we might well to call non-absurdly pure Schumann. You might think that's a joke, but I have to say, when I play this on my Steinway Model D and try and forget history, I just feel I hear bars of Schumann coming out with those octaves. And interestingly, that's where Federico, in that recording that I played, he actually splits the left hand, you might hear. Scarlatti is opening up gaps between polyphony grounded in consummate vocality and instrumental writing, so modernistic and innovative as to remind us now of the wrong century. The stated balance identified by Sutcliffe is inscribed so rigorously into K87 that it may also be reasonable to pursue it not only in the surface detail, but right into the deep structure of the music. Is there any reason to resist interpreting the imbalance of the background progression in the first half of K87, compared with its orderly disposition in the second half, as anything other than a reflection of the grande ligne itself, of what Schenker would have called a half-glimpse feature that goes on to generating the composed out version? Just a few closing comments. If Scarlatti remains one of the Western art music's mysterious figures, at least that protects us, given that we know so little about the contextual origins of K87, from committing the intentional fallacy. Even the authoritative Sutcliffe will not decide whether the characteristics of this sonata, as we perceive them, derive from history or from compositional intention. He rather implies that any answer to that question would somehow demean the interrogative nature of an exceptional musical composition. But we can justifiably seek to understand such music in a way that can at least be demonstrated without being proved. Realistically, we know a great deal about K87 without ever having heard it. For example, its melody will have a certain tessitura within quite tight limits. If it begins in B minor, it will end in B minor, and so on. Hence also the necessity for a willing suspension of disbelief, or what Samuel Taylor Coleridge also called poetic faith. How about we imagine a reverse engineering of this project of Scarlatti's? Contemplate the idea of composing an instrumental sonata that's mostly in imitative style, with some sort of meandering melody, but a high degree of motivic redundancy in all parts, a lack of chromatic development that equates it with apprenticed tonal harmony. No silences, but something sounding on every eighth note except at the double bar. And by the way, no agogics at all, no dynamic indications. As a recipe for a compositional masterstroke, such an idea may seem about as unimaginative as it would be to suggest setting the first 8 lines of Schiller's Ode to Joy in diatonic quarters, all within the range of 1 octave. Whether we know in advance that K87 possibly evinces an interrupted fundamental structure similar to those demonstrated by Schenker in other contexts is also a rather unprofitably teasing question. Without our willing suspension of disbelief, we can be content to observe Scarlatti creating what Schenker insisted that we can expect a genius composing a tonal masterpiece to create. It would be regrettable in drawing this discussion to a close for me to leave the impression that a Schenkerian reading has been its goal. If that were the case, it would have been appropriate to start with that reading rather than a title referring to a modern Portuguese novel, and to show meticulously how details of the voice leading picture in K87 are borne out by the historical facts. What this discussion has preferred to attempt is an exploration of K87, thinking about it laterally with as much scholarly diligence as possible. The residual research questions are many, from the apparently simplest, such as whether this is a slow or a fast piece, or both, and if the answer is both, then on what grounds one may assert so, to complex issues, such as the extent to which this music refers to the Passacaglia conventions of early to mid-18th century Southern European keyboard composition in general. I began by reporting that Scarlatti history is mostly fantasy. In considering the essence of value judgment in a case such as K87, admittedly here from the point of view of one committed to the aims and objectives of music theory rather than those of historical musicology, if they are different. The lesson is to inform music analytical interpretation with the nearest we can come to historical data, however thin it may be. Theory can thrive best in the oxygen of historical validity. With that appeal to the actual firmly in mind, it might be permissible to end, after all, in fantasy, thinking about Boulezz's ideal of music analysis, where the geniuses of the past speak to us about ourselves. What is it to be the saint who wrote K87, we might ask with Limonda, and Scarlatti might answer quizzically, you tell me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was so rich and provocative and thought-provoking, and as I will mention later on. But let's dive directly to the response by Professor Barbara Berry. So Barbara Berry has 5 degrees in music, 2 in piano performance, and 3 in musicology, music theory, and analysis. She holds a PhD magna cum laude from the University of London Goldsmiths College. Her teachers and mentors include Arnold Whitehall, Louis Lockwood, and Hans Keller. Her academic positions include head of music theory at the Longy School, Bard College, head of music history at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and music faculty on the Graduate Humanities program at Harvard University. She is a senior research fellow at the University of London and fellow at her Jerusalem base, the Van Leer Institute. Her publications include many articles on the music of Beethoven, Schubert, and Mahler, and she is just completing a trilogy of books on reconceiving analytic structures as problem-solving in music and the history of ideas. So the books are The Musical Matrix Reloaded, Contemporary Perspectives and Alternative Walls in the Music of Beethoven and Schubert, In Time, Map-Making Strategies and Musical Journeys, and the forthcoming Metamorphoses, Problem-Solving Strategies in Musical Structure. Barbara, let's hear your thoughts. Barbara, just make sure that you're unmuted.
Okay, is that okay? Thank you. I just would like to preface any comments by saying I'm dedicating these remarks in memory of my friend Jehoash Hirschberg, who passed away a few days ago. So Jonathan opened his very interesting paper with a number of unknowns about Scarlatti, about his life and his music. The thing about unknowns about his life, one of the things that he asks was he fatty Scarlatti? The incipient plumpness suggests in his portrait? And if so, do a few extra pounds matter in the greater scheme of things? But more seriously, does lack of biographic information matter in our evaluation of artworks? And then secondly, unknowns about his music. Is the B minor sonata an early, middle, or late work? We don't know. And of course, it's nice to know. But is this not knowing critical? Is it critical to our understanding? And then there are different ways of knowing. Jonathan proposed one scenario in the middle of a very rich paper that we might know the B minor sonata by means of Schenkerian references. For example, prolongation, long-range linear descent, and the structural dominant. I'm going to play devil's advocate and propose another kind of scenario of reference and understanding. And while such different explanations are not mutually exclusive, they are not necessarily mutually compatible. It's really like the duck and the rabbit, an ambiguous image which you can view either as a duck or a rabbit, but not both. As my friend David Lewin, a theorist at the top of his game, used to say, it's either a duck or a rabbit. There's no such thing as a dubbit. So I'm going to frame this alternative scenario by asking two questions. The first of these questions goes as follows. As experienced and practiced listeners, and all of us who are in this seminar today are experienced and practiced listeners, how do we know what's going on in this kind of work? And the second question is, what are the mechanisms of memory? So let me address the first of these questions first of all. And I'm going to start with the question about how do we know what we know? How do we know what's going on in this kind of work? By suggesting an important cognitive principle, which applies to visual objects like cars, to linguistic objects like stories, as well as to music. By saying that we, quote unquote, make sense of the world by categories as frames of reference. The basic category of a car, for example, is a metal box with an engine, 4 wheels, that can be stop, with all kinds of models within the category, sizes, colors, and shapes. we can identify then a tension, what we would call a dialectical tension in experience between recognition as frameworks on the one hand and innovation as meaningful creative modification on the other. Very often what we do as theorists and musicologists, and certainly what Schenker did, is to provide a kind of, in his terms, a kind of top-down modality to provide a framework of recognition by which to evaluate innovation. And just at this point, I would like to insert a parenthetical personal note to say that I, like Jonathan, was trained as a music theorist at King's College in London, and I also studied with Arnold Whittle, with whom he collaborated. And much of the analytic work, much of the analytic studies at King's was in Schenker's study. And I have to say that having gone through the process and worked in the technique, there is something very reassuring to search for structural dominance. But there is also something about Schenkerian technique that is circular, that in a sense, we know the answer before we can search for the question. And it's because of that that I'm asking these different questions. And as distinct from Schenker, who maintained that traditional forms are not important, as we can see in 5 graphic music analyses and in many other places, for all listeners, casual listeners as well as experienced listeners, forms are essential. They are the framework and the category within which we evaluate individual musical action. Not surprising, as in the vast majority of Scarlatti sonatas, the B minor sonata is in binary form, each section repeated, the first harmonically from 1 to 5, and the second complementary from 5 to 1. And like Nietzsche, I'm proposing that the category and its normative features are the means by which we A, recognize, and B, evaluate what is unusual and/or innovative. Overall, is it possible we could see the score with the first section? Okay. Is it possible we could see the score without the analytic reading on it? Can we maybe the IMSLP score that I sent you earlier?
Yeah, I thought that was the one.
The IMSLP score that I sent you earlier?
Oh,
Okay, we'll do, well, if not, we'll do with this one, that's fine, thank you. So overall, the first section traces the harmonic trajectory 1 to 5 over the whole of the first section. But what is interesting is that there is a nesting procedure that we'll be also able to identify in other dimensions of the music. I think we don't really need to hear it again. Thank you. The first strain of the music, that is bars 1 to, okay, the first strain of the music, bars 1 to 8, traces this harmonic route, 1 to 5, like the large 1 to 5 over the whole section. But what is interesting about the first 1 to 5 is it is back dependent. And it is this which allows the more extended, varied extension to unfold in the directed momentum towards the dominant pedal, bars 27 to the end of the section. We can identify this change of momentum from back dependence to forward articulation harmonically by a nesting microcosm. The bass line of B, E, F sharp in bars 12 to 14 pushes the harmonic direction forward with the bass B at the same tessitura with the bass B leading to the extended 5 in bars 27 to the end of the section. There is also another aspect, rhythm, which underscores the internal action as partial ambiguity to clarity. And that is that the rhythmic ambiguity of downbeat as metrical background versus the foreground rhythm and the rhythmic lines as displacement. Thank you. The displacement that only aligns it still partially at the end of the first section with the extended dominant, as we can see in the score. Now, we can identify the same kind of tension between metrical background and more ambiguous rhythmic foreground in the second section, where the consistent bass pattern of dotted quarter note, eighth note, and quarter note, which we can see in bars 39 to 43, is offset by the right hand, which uses a variant retrograde of this pattern, as we can see in bars 41 to 43. And this retrograde is rest eighth note or 2 eighth notes, dotted quarter and eighth note. You know, it's of particular interest that this retrograde, rhythmic retrograde, slightly varied as eighth note upbeat to quarter note, dotted quarter to eighth note, is the main rhythmic articulation of the long dominant as closing figure. But not only does this rhythmic pattern help provide the harmonic anchor point at the end of the first section as 5, but it also recurs as the dominant of the second section, as we can see in bars 61 to 64. So just in summary, thank you, we don't need the score at this point at the moment. We can take the score off. Thank you. So to summarize for this first point about how do we know, against formal binary structure as category, there are subtle reinterpretations of harmonic trajectory and ambiguity as narrative versus clarity as outcome. And now I want to come to my second question. What are the mechanisms of memory? This is a crucial question about not only recognizing people and events, but remembering them. So that we say, aha, we got it, okay. Memory is essential in everything that takes place in time. Our personal memories, our family memories, our Pesach memories, our social memories, and of course, our musical memories. The mechanisms of memory depend on profiles of people and motifs of music. Those defining characteristics of shape, contour, interval, rhythmic precision that enable us to recognize musical ideas when they first appear. And this is what psychologists call coding, so that we can identify them when they return, even when they return in a modified way, but they nevertheless retain identifiable characteristics. This is an essential cognitive skill based on core characteristics that enable us to identify anchor points and recognize them later in the musical narrative, sometimes in an altered but nevertheless recognizable form. I think you probably know where I'm leading. While the B minor sonata has some phrase structure anchoring, the opening and closing strains of 8 bars in the first section and 8 bars closing strain in the second section, which is actually 5 plus 3. The whole piece is otherwise more like a fantasia, or more precisely, a fantasia superimposed on the binary form of an early to mid 18th century keyboard sonata. Another aspect of fantasia type writing is the texture as counterpoint, but not in a formal sense, like Bach's quote-unquote contrapuntal disposition, or Mozart's use of counterpoint in the finale of the Jupiter Symphony. But I would suggest counterpoint in a more informal sense, like the first movement of Haydn's G major string quartet, opus 76, number 1, as a creative way of writing a string quartet. This informal counterpoint is more like a searching out or trying out how to write a binary form sonata in a new and creative way by retaining the underlying binary framework superimposed by the fantasia in what we would call, and everybody will no doubt recognize, sonata quasi una fantasia. A measure of this innovation is contrasting the B minor sonata with many of Scarlatti's other sonatas, articulated by crisp rhythmic motifs, such as the E major sonata K380, which Horowitz played in his acclaimed recital in Moscow in 1986. By way of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that both composition and analysis are problem-solving strategies. The composer's strategy goes something like this, informally, of course. How do I compose an interesting sonata in a different kind of way? The analyst's problem-solving is the complementary question, why does it work in this kind of way? So that the composer's strategy is constructive, the analyst's strategy is reconstructive. So I appreciate this opportunity to respond to Jonathan's very interesting paper on Scarlatti's B minor sonata and propose other questions in our search for musical understanding. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Jonathan, I would like to ask you, would you like to first respond to Barbara or hear my response first and then respond to both of us? What would you prefer?
Well, maybe I could give a brief response to Barbara. I've got lots of notes here. I mean, first of all, thank you. It's very moving that somebody can be bothered to even study one's work to that extent. And largely, I'd find it very difficult to disagree with anything that you said, Barbara, other than, you know, notes of inflection, what you call a retrograde rhythm. It is, I agree, in the second half, but it's also complementary rhythm. There's a simpler explanation. And the fact that Scarlatti uses it both for the contrapuntal bits and for the fandango bits seems to me the game he's playing with those complementary rhythms. And that actually is an agreement with you, because as you know, you described more beautifully than I did this idea of creative counterpoint. So I'm kind of with all of that. There's no doubt that the fantasia tradition is something that we have to think a lot about. in this context. I agree with you. It's a long and complicated story, but I would just observe it's very difficult to find early 18th century Italian music, not by Scarlatti, by other composers that we would place in that tradition that are so hypermetrically rigid as K87. One of the surprising things about K87, when you look under the hood, as it were, is it's nearly all two-bar phrases. And I think you referred to that. So yeah, I mean, I would love to argue the toss also on the epistemological question, only in the following sense. There's so much that could be said, and again, I wouldn't depart from what you're saying in any significant way, except something I wish David Lewin was still around. I would like to discuss with him. I'm very much an advocate in today's world with Yuval Harari's idea of imagined worlds as being the epistemological truth about things. I don't know whether that's a known or welcome reference or not, but it's something that has had a big impact on thinking in my circles. And I would like to ask the blessed David, who was a incredible influence on so many of us. Isn't there an imagined world in which there are actually Dobbits? And I'm not sure that he ever fully addresses that in his own stupendous work. So that's just a rapid fire response based on gratitude and appreciation, because so much of what you said is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have to say that I was very privileged to have David Lewin as a friend and a colleague, and we used to hang out in Harvard Square in pizza, tea, and coffee and swap Rossini jokes.
All right, thank you so much for these notes. So let me briefly respond myself, and it's maybe I should probably quickly mention that I am a PhD student at the Hebrew University, working with Yoel Greenberg, and also I did my DMA at Eastman School of Music, where I worked a lot with Jonathan. So that's important, and you'll understand why in a second. So here's my response. Reading Jonathan's lecture reminds me once again just how deeply his thinking has shaped my own. And here we are, just a month after Lydia Ger's brilliant lecture, once again confronting that ever-persistent issue of analysis. Now, I'd like to approach this question from the viewpoint of the performer. Though I should confess up front, I'm a violinist, not a pianist, so my relationship to Scarlatti's keyboard sonatas is a bit like a cat watching a fish tank. Admiration from a distance. Still, a study of a Scarlatti sonata, and K87 in particular, is the perfect case through which to reflect on the general issue of analysis. Its lack of biographical and historical context not only protects us from falling into Wimsatt and Beardsley's intentional fallacy, but also forces us to distill a few fundamental concerns, chief among them the problem of authority, or more precisely, what I will call imagined authority, and its role in shaping interpretation. To frame this, I'd like to start with an article I first encountered in one of Jonathan's classes, Nicholas Cook's Between Process and Product. In that monumental paper, Cook challenges the traditional model in which, quote, successive interpretations move vertically away from the composer's original vision. In its place, he proposes a horizontal model, which, as he puts it, quote, seeks to understand performances in relation to other performances, rather than in relation to the original vision supposedly embodied in an authoritative text. And he concludes, the work does not exist above the field of its instantiations, but is simply coterminous with its totality, which of course is why the Ninth Symphony, for example, is still evolving. Cook's view of the musical work as a dynamic, collaborative cultural practice rather than a the static achievement of a single individual, it remains as compelling and revealing today as it was when first published nearly a quarter century ago. It is this view that led Cook to critique the centrality of score-based analysis, suggesting in his later work that such approaches, quote, need to be placed in context and weaned from their traditional fixation with structure. And rightly so. Cook's horizontal model recontextualizes, or at the very least destabilizes, the value of certain long-standing notions of authority, such as text, theory, structure, and indeed analysis. It places performances back at the center of the work's evolving meaning and highlights the role of interpretations as something dialogical and situated. However, and here is where I part ways with Cook, he overlooks a key fact, that whether or not these traditional signifiers of authority possess real value, they retain imagined value in the eyes of most Western art music performers. And that imagined value plays an integral role in the very dynamic performative culture Cook is describing. In other words, the appeal to authority is not just persistent, it's productive. It doesn't inhibit creativity necessarily, it often enables it. To paraphrase Jonathan, interpretation thrives best in the oxygen of imagined authority. So if Cook's horizontal model offers one way of understanding how musical meaning transmits, I'd like to propose a complementary perspective, a constellational model. In this model, each interpreter orbits an imagined constellation of items taken to be authoritative and relevant to the work. These items might include the score, particular performances, historical or biographical facts, a critical edition, a theoretical framework, or a set of performance ideals. What unites these elements into a constellation is not something inherent within them necessarily, but rather something external, the interpreter's structural assumption that meaning radiates outward from them, and that it is their task to receive, interpret, and synthesize that meaning. This act of constellation building becomes itself a creative process, shaping both understanding and interpretation. In this model, the creativity of the interpreter lies not only in performing or analyzing the piece, but in the shaping of the constellation itself, choosing with which items to include, assigning weight and authority to each, and crucially, interpreting what each item, as well as the relationships between them, tell us to do. Authority in this sense is not a fixed mandate. It is itself a script to be interpreted. This is where the interpreter's voice, taste, and training come into play. Now, Jonathan's lecture exemplifies this, I think, beautifully. Faced with the absence of so many conventional markers of authority in K87, he shows us, meticulously but sensitively, what it looks like to build a constellation of items of imagined authority, and using it to construct a meaningful, historically aware, analytically grounded, and imaginatively open interpretation. Take, for example, the idea that K87 exists in a state of balance. This balance is not neutrality or indecision, but rather a dynamic tension between seemingly rival oppositions. Sutcliffe frames it as a stylistic balance. The piece hovers between being truly retro and a modernist in 18th century context. Jonathan, in turn, identifies a structural balance, right, between a surface that feels improvisatory and spontaneous, and a design that reveals itself as calculated and coherent. Now, it may feel uncomfortable that no clear-cut answers are arrived at, that the analysis doesn't resolve these tensions into a single stable reading, but the ambiguity is precisely what makes this interpretation so analytically and performatively fertile. For a performer, the notion of balance offers a way to enrich delivery with nuance and complexity. Rather than committing fully to one pole, the piece becomes a space of negotiation, a site in which conflicting stylistic and structural cues are held in productive suspension. And so, even with so much historical uncertainty, a rich and meaningful constellation can still be crafted. But let me ask you this, what about pieces for which we do have ample historical information? Works whose study does not take place in a void, and for which convincing answers to analytical or interpretive questions can, at least in theory, be provided. While it may seem that such works leave us with less interpretive elbow room, I would argue that the performer's task remains just as creative. The art of constructing a constellation of authority and interpreting the meaning and weight of its individual components is no less imaginative when the available materials are plentiful. Jonathan's lecture reminds us the value of leaving certain threads untied, of resisting the pull toward positivistic closure. His invocation of the fictional exchange between Glimunda and Scarlatti captures this beautifully, I think. Even when historical knowledge is abundant, interpretive determinism is an illusion. The questions remain, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we let it shape or resist shaping our decisions? These remain as open as interpretive as ever. Now, whether we are dealing with a piece cloaked in historical obscurity or one surrounded by a dense halo of scholarship and tradition, the task is the same, to engage with the work as something living, complex, and provisional. A musical work, then, is not a monument. It is, as Cook suggests, an ever-expanding universe. And analysis, like performance, is not about getting closer to a single authoritative center, but about reimagining the constellation that gives a piece its shape. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So let me switch back to my other hat. Jonathan, if you have anything in response to say, otherwise we can just open the discussion for everybody else with you.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you also. Very wise words and a lot to think about there. What I particularly appreciate about the model that you've offered it, I don't know if that's the right word, is, you know, one of the critiques I used to have anyway, because I've written it several times in different ways, about Nicholas Cook's very welcome emphasis on analyzing performances. Let's just put it in shorthand that way. I mean, it's all kind of, you would think it would be obvious, but he's saying that this is a fantastic resource that can feed into our understanding of the music. But I've also had this sort of absolutist critique of Nicholas Cook's campaign in that respect, because it seems to me that one of the things an interpretation can never do is exhaust the potential of a musical work. Well, we know that, you know, come back 100 years from now, which none of us will do. Who knows how people are going to be playing Scarlatti, or even those pieces about which we know almost too much, which you ask about too. And maybe, you know, your idea of a sort of imagined authority is a way of mediating between those absolute positions, because Nick is perfectly well aware of the fact that the model that he was offering about 20 years ago, still in his book of, when is it, 2016, on distributing creativity, is kind of dirigiste, you know. I mean, there's more to life than just performances, if I dare say that. It's almost a hurtful thing to say, but you know what I mean. So yeah, those are ideas that we need to juggle and tussle with all the time. Barak, do you think there is a world in which we can know too much about a piece?
Absolutely. If we don't if we think of knowledge as something limiting, as if we understand, if we don't see the interpretive move we need to do with knowledge. So I believe that might be knowing too much. But actually, I'm very curious what everyone else here has to say. If anybody has a comment or a question to Jonathan, please feel free to jump in.
Maybe shortly. I don't know, it's a little late, but I just was wondering about when you mentioned the tempo that the piece should be played in. So first of all, to me it was reminiscent a little bit of Saraband, the piece. I don't know if it's a correct comparison, but both the heavy atmosphere, I would say, and okay, the triple meter, but also that like the interplay between the triple meter and the duple meter, which you mentioned later on, the hemiolas, mostly in the second part. And to me, actually, even when there were not like clear hemiolas, so maybe Barbara actually talked about it, that the matter, the emphasis are quite ambiguous, and it kind of gives, like in the sorry, it kind of give the feeling that it should be played also like more heavy and slower. And one further note, maybe even more speculative. So like the key of the piece, B minor, is pretty untuned. That's how we say, like in mean tempered tuning. So that's, I think, also may suggest it should be played slower relatively. Just a few thoughts.
Yeah, well, let me respond to that. Those are all very good observations. I was originally very surprised when I started thinking about this piece and listening to many recordings. Really, the difference in approach. I've deliberately chosen one today, which is the slowest I know. That's Federico, and which is, to many people would be found to be sort of offensively full of Biedermeier style rubato and all that, all that kind of thing. I'm aware of that. I still say it's the greatest playing. But many of the recordings are by a factor of 2. They're, the slowest recordings are about quarter note 60, and the quickest recordings are about quarter note 120. And there are certain repertoires where we do get that huge difference in tempo. They're quite limited. Cohn wrote about this, Ed Cohn, somewhere, about the sort of absolute tempo and what's beyond analysis and all that kind of thing, and why composers choose the tempo that they do. But it does fascinate me that there is this completely such different imagined versions of this music going back over decades and decades and decades. I agree the key is interesting and special. I haven't got the stats to hand on that, but this is an unusual key. We don't know much about tuning, but you're absolutely right. Unless you live in an established equal tempered world, then B minor is a key that you have to think about. What kind of tuning is there? And I agree about the rhythmic and hypermetrical ambiguities. I mean, I think there's some argument that an upbeat tempo makes this sound more saraband. I know saraband is normally a slow dance, but still there are limits. And a fairly upbeat tempo, kind of moderato tempo, really brings out the hemiolas probably, and really brings out that second beat emphasis, or it can be done that way. It's a very curious object. What I would give to go back, and I'd love to I just need to hear Scarlatti play one bar of this piece. That's all I ask for.
Don't we all?
I have a quick question for Jonathan. It's okay. Jonathan, my question really is about analytic coherence. And that is that in your paper, you propose a number of different perspectives. And maybe you could clarify for us whether you see these as being complementary or whether you see these as being mutually exclusive, whether you see these as being multi-layered. There's one way of doing it, and now we can put another layer on, and then we could look at the Schenkerian grid. I'm just wondering about the idea of coherence, that on the one hand, we want to acquire as much knowledge and information as we can. But on the other hand, there may be a danger of too many perspectives losing some degree of focus, some degree of goal, if you like, in the way that we are looking at the piece. So would you like to respond to that?
No, I wouldn't like to because it's such a difficult question.
I know. I forgive me. But since you had so many different views, I wanted to know where you were coming from this point of view of coherence.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that they're complementary. I mean, is there such a thing as an incorrect analysis of this music? My answer to that would be yes. I mean, people who know a bit about my various scribbles over the years will know I go harping on endlessly about what I call evidence-based analysis, and then we can have a discussion over coffee what you mean by evidence. But I don't believe any analysis is a good analysis, and that's one of the problems of East Coast American theory teaching, by the way. Sort of ideology of kind of analytical liberalism, I don't know. But having said that, you know, I'm interested. I was interested when you were talking about Schenkerian analysis, and you said it's to some extent circular. I would say it's completely circular. Of course, we know.
I was being polite.
Yeah, we know what we're looking for, but
exactly. Yeah.
But then the question is whether what we're looking for is interesting or not. I mean, for instance, is it or is it not trivial knowledge that all Shakespeare's plays, every single one of them, are in 4 acts? You had better know that if you want to feel that you're understanding Shakespeare's thinking or a particular play. You know, it's not trivial information that they're in 4 acts. If there is this thing called an organic masterpiece, you know, I mean, consenting adults who are Schenkerians will talk about in private. If there is such a thing, the fact that there are common features between these objects is the least interesting thing about them. The interesting thing is, as you, Barbara, rightly said in different contexts, how does it work? So I'm not sure that the circularity troubles me that much. But that, you know, and that's another way of saying, you know, an analysis can be wrong if it misses those categorically true empirical features about a piece of music and has nothing to say about them. Then is there any point doing the analysis? So I have a goal in view, but I'm not sure that there's a very simple way to get there. And some pieces are very, very problematic.
True.
And, you know, I mean, we probably don't want to have a detailed discussion about Schenker, but some of Schenker's readings are deeply problematic too. And there's been a consensus about that for a long time. Some of them just make you think, what was he even thinking of? Whereas some of them seem to be revelatory. And maybe that's the nature of hermeneutics.
Right. So one last chance to respond or comment or argue before we close the session. Anybody has any further thing to say? All right. So thank you all so much for joining us. For me at least, it was a big pleasure to hear Jonathan's lecture and Barbara's response and to have the privilege of responding myself. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Jonathan, for just phenomenal virtuosic scholarly work. And we will, I will just say, as I always say, good night or good afternoon, wherever you are.
Well, before you turn us off,
Mhm.
Barak, as the host, can I just say a deeply warm thanks to everybody, not least for your endurance. It's an enormous tribute to know that anybody wants to listen to what one has to say. And as I said at the beginning of our meeting today, it's a great privilege to be invited. And as I said to you privately, Barak, I only wish I would love to visit Israel. I wish I were there in person. I've been wandering around Eastman joking over the last few days and saying, I'm going to Israel on Monday. And some people say, of course, and some people express great surprise. But a warm thanks to everybody, Barbara and Barak, for a huge amount of work and thought that I'm sure I don't deserve, and others for listening for so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for everyone. So have a great night or great continuation of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye.